When I thought about regulating weight, when I spoke to people at UK Dance for this presentation, I wasn't really sure exact direction that I needed to go in, because we never think of anything as a separate entity. Everything is integrated into everything else. So regulating weight was just one of the aspects that was necessary within the sport. And of course, the sport being very aesthetic, we have all the high risks. Young females in a bathing suit 6 hours a day, being judged, and anything else that you want to add to that list. So we were a very high risk for all of those components, for eating disorders and so on. Obviously, we're looking for athletes that are fairly lean and athletic. We're also looking for athletes that can be pushed. We call them the flyers. And we also look for athletes that can push. We call them the pushers. So absolutely, you don't want to have somebody who is gaining weight a couple of days before the competition and somebody has to push them 2.5 meters, 3 meters in the air. So it's a delicate balance that we always play with. One of the things that's quite critical, I think, in any kind of performance sport is your philosophy. So this was for the center. For us, it was performance consistency, and adequate nutrition is really required in order to have that performance consistency. So that was my overriding goal when I first set up the center way back in 2007. Coaching philosophies are critical as well. So these are a lot of my philosophies are here, which explains some of the reasons I took the strategies I did. So I just don't take no for an answer. I always think that there's possibilities. The physios and doctors loved me. Everything was an opportunity for learning. I thought any mistake, any success, any situation was an opportunity for us to learn and learn quickly. We wanted to set the standards really, really high. We wanted to demonstrate what we could do in public, but not what we couldn't do. So for a judge sport, that's actually quite important. So we didn't want to go out and compete before we were ready. And we didn't want to show skills that we weren't quite perfecting. So in other words, if there was an acrobatic movement that we were doing, we worked on it at home and only showed it once it was ready to have maybe a 20% chance of success. Now that's quite high in synchro. When you're doing a new acrobatic movement, you think 20% is actually very low, but in our sport, that's quite high. By the time we get to the Olympic Games or World Championships where you see this in competition, we have about an 80 to a 90% chance of having it actually function. It's not 100%. There are too many risks. We perform in an unstable environment. That environment changes all the time. Share knowledge. More will come back to you. So that's kind of unusual for a sport, but it is one of my philosophies. Improve every day, just one thing every day, and be competitive. So we need those athletes lean and athletic. Picture on the right, this is taken from the actual performance in 2000. The girl that's being pushed in the air, she's about 3 meters in the air there. She probably is about, at competitive weight, around 55, 56 kilos. The one below competitive weight would probably be around 64. Now that probably surprises you. But if we were trying to have a team of the best jumper was the one that weighed 55 kilos. So I needed to have somebody underneath her to be able to push her very well, and the rest of the team underneath to support the one that's being pushed. Because remember, we're not touching the bottom. We generate our own force. So if I had a really good jumper who was 45 and that looked really good in the air and was as flexible as this athlete, I would have used her, but I didn't. So I had no choice but to use the 55 kilo athlete. Therefore, I had to have somebody that was a little bit stronger to push her. So it changes from day to day and from year to year, depending on who your flyers are. So, synchronized swimming. Why is regulating weight really important? Well, we can go through a whole little, this is almost like our little recipe for a top synchronized swimmer. If you look over the strategic and tactical, they've got to have good recovery strategies because they're in the water training or on dry land about 6 to 7 hours a day. They need to be able to be robust and resilient. Any athlete that trains in the water, you do have an increased chance of catching colds. It's just part of the fact of being an athlete within in the pool environment. They need to be robust. the kind of injuries we have are overuse injuries. We do have stress fractures. We do have broken bones. It's usually somebody hits you in the pool with a kick. The kick is strong enough to break bones. We often perform with broken toes and fingers. Speed of movement. Of course, you need a high amount of energy for that. Same thing with the power endurance. So when we build the athlete, we do it physically. And you can see in there, a nutritionist is right in that core group. We do it technically. We do it artistically. And then we also add other, and the nutritionist is back in there again. So we kind of double wham it. So I know this was a comment about energy in and energy out. I do think of it in this way, because I need athletes to perform at a high standard with high intensity for an incredibly long period of time for training. It's not a sport that you can do quickly. You cannot learn it quickly. There's too many aspects. You need to be as strong as a gymnast. You've got to have the spatial awareness of a diver. You need to be able to do the acrobatics of a pole vaulter. Pole vaulters are incredibly acrobatic. You need to have the grace and the elegance and the flexibility of either a rhythmic gymnastics or a ballet dancer. There's too many variables in the sport. So, fuel for the engine. We defined that we would have a training weight and a competitive weight because we needed those athletes to be robust. And also in some of the physical training, a couple extra kilos actually helped in some of the weight training in the water. So we actually targeted the athletes to be changing their weight slightly as we got closer to competition. Of course, and I'm sure dancers will agree with me, that sometimes things are easier to get the jumps higher, to get the extension better, to get the higher amplitude in the air when you're slightly lighter. Now, is that from dehydration? A little bit. Is that from changing and manipulating your weight slightly? Yeah, for us it is. The shoes, by the way, was for a show that we did at the Mayfair Hotel here in London. It was for a shoe product. It was how we were doing some fundraising in the early years. And we also have an event one time a year, and we're allowed to use accessories. And this pair, Jenna and Olivia, for the first time, wore the accessories in the pool. Most competitions, they do a little dance on deck, and then they leave the accessories and they jump in. Well, we jumped in with our shoes. So it started a theme, and now the competition has the accessories in the water. Monitoring and training recovery, quite critical, the nutrition for monitoring training and for the recovery. For the athletes training hard, they need to recover. Injuries, illnesses, we need to bump up the immune system. We need to make sure that nutrition is supporting that. So what are we doing? We're trying to get good behaviors to support the following. I talked about robustness. From all the training we do, as naff as it sounds, because I like that comment today, really, it's one of those weird sports. There's no doubt about it. But it's one of those sports that's incredibly interesting and incredibly artistic and technical and physical at the same time. So we need them to be resilient, physically and mentally. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but one of the key components of one of the presentations was today that the athletes can get depressed if they're deprived a little bit too much of a certain amount of nutrition. Recovery strategies, training intensity. If I'm doing a physical training set and the athletes don't have the energy to complete the set, to me, it's not the fault of the training. Primarily, it would have been the fault of the athlete not having adequate nutrition to do that. Injury prevention. Here's a big one, education to the athletes and the staff. When we set up the center, the number one thing was to educate the athletes and the staff about nutrition and all the risks of the athlete triad, bulimia, anorexia, etc., etc. Why did I take that task? For me, sharing information. Knowledge is power. Educate the athletes what to look out for, what to know. Make them comfortable with sometimes those negative feelings that they might have. Understand that it might be normal. Have things in place to be able to deal with that. So of course we didn't educate them until we had all those things in place. We're just giving them more tools in their tool belt to make the athletes more resilient, more robust, and actually for the athletes to be more responsible. Of course, as a doctor told me later on, you've trained them very well. If they ever had any, they could hide it very well. So of course there is a fine balance. But I'm happy to put out there that we did inherit a couple of athletes that had anorexia many years before we ever came here. I came here to Great Britain, and during the 7 years up to this date, we've had no athlete diagnosed with any of those at all. And I really feel that it was because of the frank, very direct, and very education-based program that we ran for the athletes. The female athlete triad, of course, that's quite critical because of the bones. If you think about synchronized swimmers, they don't have any impact on the floor. So we need to make sure that the nutrition is very good and that we do a significant amount of weight training to make sure that we counterbalance that. And of course, iron deficiency. So we do the basics. This is very, very basics. This might be a young athlete coming into the program at the beginning. I won't go through all the details, but it's just a basic nutrition plan. You know, where would we start? Stage 1, we'd always start with screening, then the delivery, and then the summary and expectations. And one of the key things at the bottom, you can see it says re-administer questionnaire. Check to make sure you had impact. Getting a little bit more sophisticated, this would be something that we would present to the athletes. This is something that they would actually contribute to. There are 8 key questions here, and they would fit within this little cycle here. So the athletes themselves are giving the nutritionist and the sports psychologist and the coaches information about where they are on each of those areas. 4, did you eat and drink your recovery within the 30 minutes to finishing the session? Sometimes it's easy to forget that because it could have had planning preparation before. They didn't bring it with them. For us, we had to make sure that we plan snack sessions within the pool. I know that sounds silly, but if you're training, they're out there in the middle of that 30-meter pool by 25, they've just done a difficult exercise, they're going to float, kind of done dead man's float, out there to recover and not waste energy to swim to the side, pick up the water bottle or the almonds or whatever they have as their snack, and then swim back. That's more fatiguing. So we actually had to stop training, bring them in, have a video session, make sure we have our nutrition, send them back out. So it was something that we actually strategically planned to ensure that the athletes got into the habit of make sure that they maintain the nutrition during the long training sessions. Body fat. We talk very frankly about body fat. Why? Synchronized swimming in water. One of the critical components is where is your float point? So this is the water level. We would do an exercise where we have just the ankle sticking out and they're using isometric strength to hold themselves there on a vertical axis. You have to find your balance and find your float point. Then you can take it up and work hard at the higher level. So the accuracy of the body line, the plumb line, has to be very, very precise. An athlete losing, I don't know, half a pound changes their float point, changes their center of gravity in the water. So you have to readjust the technical level. So we're consistently checking the technical positions to readjust so that the day you start by checking the technical balance, this is where it is today, great, now you know every time you put your leg in the air, instead of feeling at 12 o'clock, you need to feel like your leg is at 12:52. We're using the clock here to help visualize where the leg has to be. Okay, we never got down to 12:52, but we would do it in quarters, so 12, 12:15, 12:30, etc. So that was pretty key. Are you happy with your pre-game eating routine? So like many athletes, they don't like to eat in the morning because we start training at 7. So it's an experimentation of what is. So we accepted that they didn't like to eat. What we didn't accept is they did not have calories in their system to initiate training. So we had to come up with a compromise, and that was an individual-based program for each of the athletes to play with what made the difference for them. Made them feel good, but also allowed them to have the fuel for the day. Hydration. key component. In the water, why? Well, in the water, sometimes you forget to drink. But in order to set up a program to really educate the athletes on what they needed to do, and we need to have coaches' cooperation to do all of this, these were key questions that we would ask at different times. Here's just an example, a quick example of a training session in the morning. We did a speed swimming session because they have to be fast swimmers. We did a strength and conditioning, that's the S&C, and then we did land drill, which is a minimal. It's basically marking out the program on land for synchronization. So this is one athlete in particular's plan and a specific nutrition to have pre and post event. So we individualized those plans. The training, the competition, the recovery, the injury management, that was key. Rehabilitation, boosting the immune system, helping with anti-inflammatory, finding out what nutrition helps to keep the muscles from getting too sore, what helps with lactic acid, individualized training, and then also this is post-competition, so what do they do when they're on break? And also the feel-good file. We call it the feel-good file. So if it made you feel good by having a square of chocolate a day, then eat a square of chocolate a day. Because this is a critical component of the overall plan. So reflection and review. One of our processes of questions that we would ask the athletes. Green is good, amber, and that's supposed to be a red. It looks a bit orange, but it's a red. Finding it difficult to rehydrate, weight is consistently in the red. The red is either up or below their competition or their training weight or wherever they were supposed to be. Sudden tiredness or weight drop over 2 kilograms from baseline. Weight fluctuating, but you don't know why. So here's a good example of where getting too skinny is detrimental. Athlete here performing rocket split. So rocket split is the middle slide, a variation is to the right. Yep, she gets that height all by herself. Nobody's pushing. That's all generated from power from the core and from the arms and the legs. So this athlete was having a dental wisdom tooth withdrawal in the hospital. It happened on a break time. Perfect timing, adequate recovery time was there before she started. It was in the pre-competitive season. The athlete picked up the norovirus in the hospital, lost weight. Really good plan we had in place to bring her back up to a really good standard. Happened, we went to a competition. These are where these photographs were taken. Really great height out of the water. She was probably only 5 kilos lighter than normal. But what happens when you lose weight? For flexibility. The mass changes. So in the glutes, in order to get a split position, she would oversplit. So she didn't have the strength to balance out the new range of movement because the body mass had changed. So this athlete had a stress fracture. And this is just an end-on view to show that this is an extreme oversplit. One of the key things was weight management, to identify what our training weight was and what our competition weight was, and where that balance would be for that particular athlete. And for this athlete, it was only 2 kilos. That was her range. And she was incredibly accurate. She could maintain that weight and know exactly what it was continuously, but she knew her body. This is a great photo. I just put this in. I was training the Spanish team, doing some choreography. I had a little underwater camera, and I said, okay, guys, it's the end of a long training session. We've been in the water 10 hours. Can you believe it? 10 hours creating this Salvador Dali routine for the 2008 Olympics. I said, okay, can you just go and do something? I need a picture for my presentations. This was way back in 2003, and that's what they did, and that was the only snapshot I took. So these are still artists. I thought I wanted to bring that in because they may be physical beings, but they are truly artists. Thank you.